There were a few alternatives to the big social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, but none of them had really ever taken off in the way that Parler did.
In the days since the election, many are flocking to a new social media app called Parler.
We're now looking at about 8 million users, which is a pretty significant jump for a platform that's only been around for about 2 years.
Parler is the #1 free app in the country, even above TikTok.
In the age of Facebook and Twitter, starting a new social media network isn't easy. As political rhetoric began heating up online leading up to the 2020 presidential elections, so did the amount of users that felt they were being censored for expressing their opinions.
My viewpoints are clearly being suppressed. You can't tell me to not.
These censorship operatives are only focused on the right, making sure we're not here.
Personalities like Michael Lindell and Donald Trump, whose tweets and messages have gotten them deplatformed, are going off to start their own self-styled free speech social networks.
It's going to be all the influence. It's going to bring back our free speech.
In reality, sustaining an online media platform isn't as simple as having the idea.
Apple has banned the fast-growing Parler app.
Parler is a case study in how just having a basic technological stack and the motivation to go and build and market something is one of the smaller parts of actually operating a social networking service.
Parler was founded by a man named John Mates, who started the company with one of his college classmates.
A week ago, you said, John, you should come back on the show once you guys hit 8 million users, and I'm sorry we waited too long.
He worked in the family office of Robert Mercer, as kind of their IT administrator.
Robert Mercer, who formerly ran one of the world's most successful hedge funds, has been a political megadonor over the last decade and was the funding behind the far-right Breitbart News.
So he was able to get money from Rebecca Mercer, Robert Mercer's daughter, who is a well-known conservative megadonor who ran an influential PAC for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential campaign.
A new app called Parler has become a hit with conservatives who call the social media platform a refuge for free speech.
The company was founded in 2018 and brands itself as a, quote, unbiased social media.
Well, I think people are waking up and looking at what's going on these other social platforms, and they're seeing how everything's so curated and how they're being manipulated, and they just want to go somewhere where they're not going to be controlled.
Parler started back in 2018 as an alternative to Twitter, also taking some ideas from Reddit and other social media platforms. And it was intended to be a less heavily moderated version of Twitter, essentially, catering towards people that were potentially deplatformed on Twitter or similar platforms.
An alternative social network might sound good in theory, but they're notoriously expensive to keep up and running. While the initial investment by the Mercers helped Parler get started, it needed to grow a big enough user base to attract advertiser dollars.
Social networks make money primarily through advertising. They have your attention, you're scrolling through the feed, and so they'll put messages from brands or advertisers in the feed to subsidize the fact that most of these services are free. They know your name, your age, your gender, usually where you live. Oftentimes, they might know what websites you visited, what products you looked at. So, for example, if you're scrolling through your feed and you see a pair of shoes that you were just looking at online, that is a form of retargeted advertising. They know you thought about those shoes, and now the advertiser wants to put them back in front of you in hopes that you'll buy them.
This is why it's historically been difficult for smaller social networks with limited audiences to make money. The fewer eyes for advertisers to target, the less value there is for brands to spend their advertising dollars.
When you look at big social networks, the amount of money that it takes to operate those services is immense, right? Because you have employees, you have engineers who are building that, you have lawyers who are dealing with objectionable content or copyright issues, you have marketing people who are promoting these products.
Yet, despite these challenges, Parler was actually able to build and grow a steady user base.
Our business model is going to be an ad revenue model. It'll be specific around influencers, so advertisers will target the influencers and those people with a large reach, rather than us as a whole platform.
There were various spikes in user growth over time, but it really didn't get a ton of traction until 2020 during the elections, when other social networks started doing more labeling of content, more fact-checking.
Do you notice how anything the left says, is any of it ever blue flagged like that?
A lot of the user base was put off by that. They perceived it as, partisan.
Anybody here been censored on social media? It's a lot of hands.
The site really kind of exploded when a lot of conservative influencers and elected officials started using and pretty aggressively promoting the site.
This platform gets what free speech is all about.
Can we now move everybody from Twitter to Parler?
There were only a few 100,000 users, and over time, before it was initially deplatformed, that rose to around 13 million or so users.
That's more than 3 times the number of users that Gab, a previously lightly moderated platform, had registered despite launching 2 years earlier in 2016. Though Parler did attract record numbers of users compared to apps like it in the past, it was still running with fairly limited resources.
I think for most of their existence, they had a very small development team with not a lot of experience, and that worked fine with smaller amounts of users. They had multiple times when they had to deal with outages as user interest was starting to spike. It had some privacy compromises where more user data was getting distributed than should have been, the most prominent being that it wasn't scrubbing metadata from any of the videos or photos that were being uploaded.
Unlike Twitter, you have to supply your driver's license, a photo of yourself.
Those are optional additional steps, so that's called a real-world verification.
This would prove costly for Parler, as security researchers were eventually able to scrub the site for 70 terabytes of user data, meaning those driver's license photos that users uploaded to gain verification were potentially at risk. And although Parler bills itself as a free speech platform, there are still limits as to what you can share online.
So in the United States, you can post a lot of stuff on the internet, but there's some stuff that you legally cannot. And so what that means is you can't truly run a platform in the way that Parler describes. You have to have some moderation.
So the information we have regarding how Parler was doing moderation is mostly based around what some folks found within the application. It was a quite basic system. They said that they were hiring paid moderators, but this was mostly just something that people did as they felt like it.
Content moderation is expensive, and Parler never did scale up a moderation team that could keep up with the surge of users after the 2020 presidential elections, making it a breeding ground for mis- and disinformation. That misinformation would eventually lead to the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, where the attacks were being glorified on Parler in real time.
It wasn't so much that January 6th was organized on Parler, but it was more that Parler, by its own fault, happened to be the most valuable repository of January 6th evidence immediately after the 6th. It inadvertently became kind of key evidence against its own users. The photos and videos that were uploaded to Parler have been kind of key evidence in identifying the people who were there and also used in the prosecution.
They had pressure from their hosting provider, from Amazon, specifically calling out particular pieces of content that were active on the site, not being moderated. Amazon gave them an ultimatum to essentially clean up their content or get off the platform.
The celebrations on Parler of the January 6th insurrection in Washington ultimately prompted Amazon, Google, and Apple to cut the app from their servers.
But now big tech is cracking down, including Apple, which removed Parler from its app store, saying that posts on Parler related to the riot on Capitol Hill included calls for violence, which violate store rules.
They also had other service providers who did their phone number authentication. They had that suddenly pulled out from under them, which caused some issues with their authentication systems and anti-spam systems.
Content moderation is a really tricky beast, quite frankly, because on the one hand, it is expensive. It takes a combination of technology, but also human beings to review things, because a lot of this is nuanced or intricate. And so, you talk about someone like Facebook who gets really crushed for their inability to properly moderate their service. They're still spending billions of dollars every year on this effort, and they're struggling and or failing in a lot of cases. And if you're a new business, you're probably not going to be able to afford that.
Parler CEO John Matz said he was fired last Friday by the company's board. In a statement, he said over the past few months, he's met constant resistance to his product vision.
According to John Mates, he was fired by Rebecca Mercer in the aftermath of January 6th. He said that they didn't agree with his vision for the product, and that he had proposed that they do more about hate speech and do more moderation. And now, very, very dramatically, honestly, is suing Rebecca Mercer and suing the entire board of directors of Parler. It's an ongoing litigation.
Parler, Mercer, and Mates didn't respond to several requests for comment. Parler and Mercer have previously denied the allegations in Mates' complaint, which is pending in Nevada State Court. Mates was fired due to his own poor decision-making, lack of loyalty to the company, and general lack of fitness to serve as Parler's CEO, Parler said in court filings. After Mates was ousted on January 29th, Parler announced a new interim CEO, Mark Meckler, in February. Under him, the app agreed to tone down some of its content in order to be accepted back on Apple's App Store.
The site is back up and running. We're welcoming back our 21 million users.
But by the time Parler came back online in mid-February, users had long moved on.
Mostly what we see with a lot of these alternative platforms is that there are maybe one or two discrete spikes of user creation, but their growth does tend to flatten out over time as people kind of lose interest and aren't getting the same dynamics they want from a social networking site.
Parler isn't the first self-styled free speech social media platform on the scene, and it certainly isn't the last. In October 2021, former President Trump, who had been permanently banned from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and a number of other social media sites in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, announced that he would be launching his own social network called Truth Social.
We heard from former President Trump yesterday that he is starting his own media platform. What's your take on this? Will this work?
The biggest difference with Truth and President Trump's effort to build a social network is simply that it's being started by someone who already has a massive following and massive influence. The challenge will be, how do you maintain that? What we know about President Trump is that he likes to make sure his message is everywhere. He would always post on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, but he wanted things to be widespread. What is the motivation or the incentive for me to sign up for that network if I can get his message in other places?
But as we've also seen with past attempts of these types of niche social networks, history tends to repeat itself.
I think what everyone who tries to launch their own alternative social media platform quickly realizes is that making an alternative social media platform is actually really hard. Parler is kind of this perfect example of the arc that many of these sites will take. They'll kind of launch with some bare bones infrastructure. They'll get some kind of artificial boosting and support, right? But it doesn't actually mean that people really like using the site.
In recent years, there have been calls for social media to be more regulated as their effects on society become clearer.
One of the things that makes a Facebook or a Twitter so dangerous is that their scale is so big and the ability to spread stuff is so easy that bad stuff can basically spread before the company has a chance to react. A few years ago, there was the Christchurch shooting, and there was a video posted on Facebook, and the company said, hey, we removed something like 90% of the videos automatically right away. Well, that means 10% still existed at least for some time on the network. They're just so big that even a small percentage that gets through can impact millions and millions of people.
What, if anything, are companies doing to stop the dissemination of hatred?
And so something that feels radical might not actually make huge waves on a site like Parler, but might have a lot more impact on something like Facebook simply because of the audience it's reaching.
And increased government regulation could mean that smaller, niche social networks may have an even harder time staying afloat.
Right now, what we're seeing is companies like Facebook are kind of starting to push for regulation because they know that they will be able to comply with it, and other sites will have more difficulty. So it actually gives them a bit of a market advantage.
In a way, Parler's lack of success, especially right after January 6th, when the App Store and the Google Play Store and Amazon kicked them off. In a weird way, that failure by Parler may have been success for the overall kind of movement toward, feeling that big tech is too powerful, is overstepping its boundaries, because this gave a lot of fuel to that fire. And a lot of people who were already worried about big tech's power suddenly had another very prominent, very public example to point to when it came to, in their mind, overstepping.